Hey guys, welcome to Christ Culture and Coffee. I'm your host, Robbie Lashua, here with my co-host, Tyler Hurley. What's up, bro?
Hey, what is up? We are super excited to be continuing our series with you guys today on Counterfeit Jesus.
Yeah, Counterfeit Jesus is. Jesus is?
Jesus is.
Counterfeit Jesus
Multiple
is.
Jesus.
Multiples. Yeah,
Many Jesus.
We got to define who this Jesus guy was and what he taught. And it's crazy because everyone wants a piece of Jesus.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I've always been fascinated about. The Muslims want him. The Latter-day Saints want him. The atheists don't mind him.
Hindus
Christians
even
want
throw
him.
him in there. Yeah.
Hindus, everybody wants a piece of Jesus. Everybody likes him. It's interesting. So we want to get to the bottom of what different worldviews think about who this guy was, and then we're going to cap it all off because it's Christmas season with who he actually was, and what he came to do, and we're going to take him at his word. But today we're going to talk about the atheist, agnostic, skeptic view of Jesus. Now, what we always do on this show, if you're a new listener, is before we get into that, we have a coffee tip because both of us love coffee.
We love coffee.
Maybe addicted to coffee?
A little bit.
A little bit. I think coffee's addicted to me.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's where it's come to.
It needs more of you.
Yeah, it needs more of me. Hey, and speaking of, since we're talking about atheists today, I love this joke. I don't know if you've heard of this.
Okay, let's hear it.
So every morning I get up and I'm an atheist before my first cup of coffee. Have you heard that one before? Before my first cup of coffee, I'm an atheist. Hey, listeners, you can use that one for free, all right, on your friends.
That's great, yeah.
To emphasize the importance of the caffeinated beverage. But anyways, we want to start with a coffee tip. And Tyler, you have got an interesting coffee tip for us today.
Yeah, I do. And actually, so last week, if you guys listen, I talked about Mormonism as like their counterfeit idea of Jesus. And with that, I gave you guys a coffee tip kind of tailored around that topic. And so I kind of wanted to keep up that tradition for this series with this episode. So this has kind of like been a joke or like something that I've heard like Christians talk about. And it's something that's interesting, but it's like atheists just make the best coffee. Have you heard that before?
Yeah, it's like the idea that, the more secular or atheistic or liberal,
the more hipster or whatever,
then the better the coffee. Well, when we had Mark Driscoll on a while back, he said that.
He did, you're right. Yeah. Actually, I remember that now. Yeah, and so that's kind of like a lingering idea. So I thought, you know what, let's put this to the test.
Yeah, is it true or is it not, right?
Yeah. I want to look at statistically. And now this is just something that's interesting. I looked up, first of all, I looked at a story that was published by NBC, and they did a holistic review of the top 10 cities in the United States for coffee that are highest rated for just their local coffee chains. So like specifically how they make coffee themselves. And so I'm going to read just like the top 5 of that list really quick. So the cities that NBC places in the top 5 in the U.S. for best coffee is New York at number 1. New York. Seattle, Washington at number 2.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, right. San Francisco, California.
Okay.
Portland, Oregon.
Yeah.
And Los Angeles, California.
Okay.
Yeah, so those are the top 5 cities in the U.S. for coffee.
Okay.
Now, I'm like, how do I kind of like gauge this? Because like you got to see, like, how do you determine if it's atheists that are making the coffee and like if that's the reason it's so good? You know what I mean?
Influence or
something. Yeah, if there's an influence,
sure.
something like that. So what I did was I did some research with Pew Research and World Atlas. Like I looked around a few different sources to get a statistic on the estimated amount of atheists living in those states.
Okay.
So just a couple of examples for the states, which I guess a couple of the cities are covered in this category.
Sure.
So we got for atheists, the state of Washington is probably the highest atheist population out of the top coffee cities.
Okay.
43.7% of Washington
atheist.
is atheist. Yes, according to the research here, and then 43.4% in Oregon.
Okay, so there's Seattle and Portland.
Yeah, exactly. And that's their position on the list is number 5 for Washington and number 6 for highest populated atheist states. Okay, and then for California, 13th place in the statistics at 37.8% atheist population. And as for New York, that one shocked me a little bit more. It's a little lower on the list at 15.
Okay.
It is 37.1% atheists in New York.
Interesting. So there might be some correlation there.
Yeah, I think so.
The more population of atheists, the better the coffee.
And that's the case. And now it's interesting because some people have said, well, you know what, like it's the liberal states that make the best coffee, or conservative, but I don't think it's necessarily about like the political environment. More is it's just the culture, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that comes along with just, you know, I think, of course, the dense population of atheists in those states, because of the idea of like the lack of traditional aspect of having like a religious belief system. Maybe that has an influence on the culture. So they're like, we want to be different. And
if people aren't going to church on Sunday, they have more time to perfect their roasting.
So there you go. Yeah. Yeah. So it's like,
knows?
There's not a real reason that you can point to, I think, of like, oh yeah, like atheists are the reason for coffee being better. But it's an interesting coincidence at the very least.
Yeah, it is.
That the best coffee cities are some of the like higher density populated areas for atheists.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah,
man.
so an interesting coffee.
What's the number one state that atheists live in?
Yeah, let me check that. It's Vermont, actually.
Yeah, the north.
Yeah,
northeast,
it's 56.3% of the population claims to be atheists in Vermont.
Okay, well, and then that always gets weird because like population wise, like Vermont,
sure.
there's nobody lives there.
Well, yeah.
So again, it's population based on the state.
Yeah,
so there's
of
way
course.
more atheists probably.
Well, like
in
the second
Washington,
one after that is at 51%, and that's in Maine. So it's like a
so
little bit of a bigger
New England area.
Yeah,
that
so
makes sense.
that's kind of how it is. I mean, obviously, Rhode Island and Hawaii are pretty high on this list too. So it's like, you know,
the
like
smaller places have less population,
Sure,
but
yeah.
more interesting.
more percentage wise. So
That's crazy, man.
That's the coffee tip for you guys. It's more of just like an interesting fact, like something to think about.
If you want to
like,
get good coffee, though, go to more atheistic cities. That's the idea,
I guess in New York, Seattle, Portland, you know, those are the places to go.
San Fran, LA, if you have to. That's the worst one, though, right? That's the lowest.
It's closer for us, but you know.
Yeah, I don't
that's
know if
how
we
it
can
is.
get in there now. Yeah,
That's true. Yeah, you're right.
Anyway,
so there we go.
That's cool, man. Thank you for that. Well, hey, we're going to get started with talking about the topic of the day, the counterfeit Jesus that, you know, atheists, agnostics, skeptics kind of propose. And there's different variations of this and there's different opinions. And we're going to kind of just go after one that's pretty popular now. But one of the different ideas within the atheistic, agnostic, skeptical view I did want to mention before we get started on what we're going to talk about. Right. And it's this view that Jesus is just a myth. Like there is no historical Jesus. This person, Jesus of Nazareth, didn't actually exist. He's just a legendary ideology, mythology that developed. And we've actually met people who believe this. Who've written books on this, and it is
People put a lot of time into it.
Yeah, but it's such an extreme idea. Nobody in academia really takes it seriously that Jesus of Nazareth didn't even exist as a historical person, because there's so much data against it. There's so much evidence that he did exist, not just from the New Testament, but from non-Christian first century sources.
It's to the point where it's like, you don't have to really take that much of a leap of faith to believe he existed, because and the thing is like atheists will agree with that. Like the major well-educated atheists that are out there would agree, he existed. And that's something that a lot of people try to fight against. I mean, there's people out there that will.
It's just such a dumb thing to fight against. It is. There's so much evidence that he did exist. So if you want to dive into that whole argument, we're not talking about that today.
Right.
But a really great book to read is by an agnostic atheist named Bart Ehrman, and it's called Did Jesus Exist? The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth. And the whole book is about, yes, of course he existed from an atheist standpoint.
Right, yeah.
Because he's just doing good history. So if you want to check into that, Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? Is fantastic, and you should check that out.
Yeah, of course. So today we want to discuss, though, the idea of Jesus not being who the New Testament depicts him to be. And was Jesus actually the author of who the authors of the New Testament described him to be?
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're looking at here today, because that's kind of the myth or the ideas that are being thrown out there in atheism. So we're kind of going to just tackle those claims and break it down a bit more. So when it comes to who Jesus is described to be in the New Testament, there are actually 4 options for how we can view the truth claims, okay?
And I think, I thought through this a lot. I think there's only 4. Like, there might be another way to look at it, but I don't know what it would be.
Yeah. So we're listing, though, 4 options.
Yeah, and I do think they're the only 4 options out there, but there might be, who knows, there might be more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 4 credible is what we should say, to some extent, I
don't
guess.
know what else
I wouldn't even
would
say credible.
be a good option, but...
Yeah, I don't know. So while I'm gonna say this here, this is very interesting. While at Oxford, between the years of 1942 and 44, C.S. Lewis made a series of radio broadcasts, and in 1952, these radio talks were put to print under the name of Mere Christianity. Now, this book has since become a Christian classic and has helped many to understand the basis for Christian faith. And one argument of this book has come to be known as Lewis's trilemma.
Yep, the trilemma of Lewis.
Yeah, and now this is so popular, like in the Christian community now. Like it's
a lot of people know this. If you haven't read Mere Christianity, you need to read it. Get it in your stocking this year. Tell people you want it for Christmas. When you get your Amazon card, buy a copy of Mere Christianity.
Yes,
it's great.
Matter of fact, really coincidental. I'm actually just starting to read through this right now again.
Oh, so good.
I've read it before. I need to touch on it again. It's been a while.
It's a great book
because it's a really good book. And so the argument of Lewis's trilemma that he states, he said the argument states that Jesus was one of the 3 things. Okay, one of the following: he was either a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord divine.
Yep. He has to be one of the 3, according to Lewis.
The 3 L's.
Now, we mentioned we're going to talk about 4.
Correct.
Because there's been a modern day development of people who say, listen, he doesn't have to be one of those 3. There's actually a 4th option.
Right.
So we're going to look at a 4th option. But
this is where it started.
Yeah, this is where it started. So Lewis's argument is you have to think Jesus was lying, he was crazy, or he is who he said he was.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we're going to take this argument, we're going to look at new developments that have happened in atheistic writings, and then we are going to kind of see where the evidence leads on it.
Yes, and now we're going to start with liar. That's the first one.
Let's start out with liar. So, okay, let's take the stance that Jesus was lying, that what he says in the New Testament are lies, right? This view is that Jesus knew he was deceiving people. He knew he wasn't who he said he was. He knew he didn't come to do what he said he was going to do, and he was intentionally leading people astray.
Okay,
so he knows he's lying. That's the big idea. So this is the question that we've got to ask in regards to this. What would be Jesus' motive to lie? What did he gain? What was he seeking to gain? What's the motive that pushed him to be such a deceptive human being? Typically, people lie to get ahead in some way. Right? Whether it's financially, whether it's with power, whether it's with sex, those are usually reasons
there's something that you're
lie.
trying to gain out of it.
Yeah. So that's the question we go, okay,
what's
was
the
Jesus,
motivation?
Yeah, what was Jesus trying to gain? He didn't really get famous in his own time. Nobody outside of Jerusalem really knew who he was, or outside of Israel really knew who he was, right?
Right.
Did he get sex? Did he get money? Did he get power from any of those things, right? So it's difficult to believe that this was Jesus' motive and he was lying to get these things, especially when you consider what he taught about moral virtues.
Right.
So you look at, what did Jesus say about sex? What did Jesus say about power? What did Jesus say about money? And he kind of says the exact opposite of what people typically lie
to say that he was claiming to get.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to look at, okay, what did Jesus say about money, sex, and power? Yeah,
and I'm going to read a passage actually that kind of touches on this. We're going to go through a few examples. In Matthew 20:26 through 28, Jesus said, "Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many."
That's
right?
huge. So he's telling them, listen, greatness isn't about gaining worldly power.
Of course,
it's about serving other people.
And that's very counter to that idea that he was a liar and that he was out for personal gain, right?
Yeah, but is he lying about this? And then he's trying to, how are you gaining power by telling people you came to serve them?
Well, and the thing
doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, he didn't just say this, but like he actually lived it out. He wasn't a hypocrite in that through the other people reporting on how Jesus lived his life.
Yeah.
Like Jesus washed the disciples' feet, right?
Yeah.
And then he eventually died for them. I mean, that's obvious.
So his actions backed up his teachings.
Yeah, of course.
So what if he was lying? What's he gaining?
Right. That's the point.
If he knows he's lying.
If he knows he's
intentionally lying.
Yeah. What does he have to gain?
Yeah.
Jesus even taught a strict view of sexuality.
Yes.
So that kind of takes away the idea of like that he was after sex, right? Like he said repeatedly that like these strict views of sexuality, saying that lusting after a woman was as sinful as committing adultery. So
like
the
Sermon on the Mount, right?
Yeah,
It talks about that.
So even by looking at a woman lustfully is considered adultery.
Committed adultery with her in her heart, right?
Yeah. And why would he say that if that was something, like and so that's another part of it.
Let's go. Okay, so let's look at like even going back to last week with the LDS founder,
right?
Joseph Smith. He lied.
Yeah, he did,
and he intentionally lied to his people and kept secrets actually from his first wife in order to marry other women.
Well, yeah, he sought out money, he sought out sex, and he sought out power. He got all three of those things.
He did get all three of those things. So if Jesus is lying, the question becomes, what was his motivation to do it? It seems so crazy because he didn't get any of those things. And then he actually teaches against those things. If you're trying to lie in order to get money, sex, or power, you're going to begin teaching that certain things are okay.
Yes.
You're going to introduce your followers to, I know what the Old Testament says, but here's the new sexuality.
At the very least, you would think that you'd have some reports or claims from somebody else saying, oh, he did this that was counter to his teaching, or he said XYZ, like we would see some sort of example with how many people were around him, right?
You'd think so.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean.
The other problem with it is, so if he doesn't only say, hey, we're sticking to the Old Testament view of sexuality.
Of course.
He makes it harder.
He does.
So he doesn't,
You're right.
You would see him giving allowance for sexual leniency, right? But no, he doesn't. He makes it more difficult of a thing. Like, it's not just committing the act of adultery. It's looking on people with lust. And people are like, man, like, this is tough. Like, who can do this stuff you're saying, right?
Yeah.
And so it's so, to say that he was lying is very tough to found when you look at his character and his actions and his teachings.
Yeah, and then again, just going further with his view of money, right? Like he wasn't out for financial gain with this. I mean, even Jesus said himself in Matthew 6:24, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth."
Yeah, you cannot serve God and wealth.
You can't. Yeah,
and then again, how does his actions play out?
He's pretty poor too throughout
poor throughout his whole life.
Yeah.
He's just a carpenter in Nazareth. And then through his ministry, he doesn't have a home. He's like traveling around all the time.
Yeah, he's just kind of hopping around.
Living off the benevolence of other people.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's doing.
He even tells that one guy, the guy says, hey, I want to come follow you. And he says, hey, foxes have holes, but the Son of Man doesn't even have a place to sleep tonight. And the guy's like, I don't know about that. I don't know about following you. Right?
Yeah.
He didn't have nice places to stay. He didn't have a ton of money. That wasn't his focus. And so what was the motivation for him lying? If he was lying to gain sex or power or fame or money, he was a terrible failure, and he was teaching against those things, which would make it more difficult for him to ever gain those things.
Yeah, that's exactly the case.
So I don't see the liar idea being very credible.
No, it's not. And it's just, you just see, I mean, these are just a few examples of like dozens. I mean, I was probably arguing actually like hundreds of examples that we see where Jesus lived out a life and said things that are completely counter to that idea.
To the idea of gaining
power.
Things.
Exactly.
Yep. So the idea Jesus was lying is very contradictory, considering the moral code he taught, the moral code he lived by, and the actions of selflessness he did for other people.
Right.
So
Yeah. And so I would say that also, if Jesus was a liar, how did he get famous, right? That's the question. It is popular today to hear people say Jesus was a good teacher, but he wasn't God and he didn't rise from the dead, right?
Well, and that's what sometimes atheists even say. Like, listen, the reason he's famous is because he's a good teacher, but the miracle stuff is bogus.
Right, of course, yeah. And that's the thing. Like, if he was a liar, he was not a good teacher is the thing, though.
That's
That's what people don't understand.
You can't claim he's a good teacher if you're claiming he was a liar.
Exactly. And I think a lot of this, especially modern day teaching, it stems from just a lack of education about who Jesus is and like what happened when he was like teaching, because
people just don't know what he said.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think people know what he said, and that's something that's interesting, because when you confront atheists or just any agnostic or someone making these claims with what Jesus taught on, and then ask them like, hey, then if this is what he's teaching, and if you're telling me that it's not true, then that would make him a liar, which therefore does not make him a good teacher.
It makes him evil.
It makes him evil.
Because if he's telling people that you can go to heaven if you believe in me, and I came to die for your sins to give my life as a ransom for many, and he's just lying about it, he's deceiving people. He's leading people completely astray. So you can't hold to the idea that he was a good moral teacher if you believe that he was a liar.
Yes, exactly.
So that leads to the second point we want to talk about today. So what if he was a good moral teacher and he didn't know he was lying about stuff?
Right. Okay.
So he's deceived. He really believes what he's saying is true, which is Lewis's idea of being a lunatic or a crazy man, right? So what if he was just crazy? He really believed he was the Son of God. He really believed he came to redeem all humanity from sin. And he was teaching these things not to deceive people, but because he was crazy and he was mistaken about reality.
Yes, exactly.
But he really himself believed
that
it.
he was delusional into actually believing that he was God.
Yes.
That's
so there's no lying going on, but it's still not true.
Yes, exactly.
Yep. So that's the lunatic idea.
Yeah, and so this is kind of like a tough position to believe in when you read just like all the things that Jesus said when he was arguing with the Pharisees and Sadducees, right? Like, it's crazy. We can just see all throughout those encounters.
Yeah, the reason it's crazy is because he shows such great intelligence.
He does.
Against the smartest people of his time.
Because you see that he is intelligent to know the law and the history by heart. Like, he's not having to
he studied, right?
Yeah.
He knows the Old Testament really well. He knows the judicial laws. He knows the difference between rabbinical tradition and the Old Testament law.
Of course, yeah.
And he cuts through that line when they say, "Why aren't your disciples doing all the ceremonial washing?" And he's like, "Well, that's not the law. That's your traditions. Why do they need to follow traditions of men?" He talks about, right? When the Pharisees and Sadducees come to him in Matthew 22, which is just such an awesome chapter of Jesus showing up the smart guys in the big city. That's what this chapter should be called. Jesus goes to Harvard is what it should be called.
Yeah.
And he's showing everybody up, right? The Pharisees come and argue against him, and he shows them based on a verb tense in Exodus why their whole argument against him is just stupid. At the end of that, I love what it says is he points out to them why God and the afterlife actually are true, that people do live after they die. And he says, because God said to Moses, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," not "I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob."
Yeah.
Because God said that 400 years after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have died.
Yeah.
And he says, "I am." So Jesus says he is present tense, not
meaning
was
they
past
are
tense,
still alive. Yeah.
Meaning they're still alive. Have you read the Bible? That's what he's doing to the smart guys. And I love what Matthew 22:33 and 34 says. It says, when the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching, right? But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together, and they were concocting an argument against
because just imagine like that clicking for them when he's pointing out, when he said, "I am."
Yeah, how do you argue against that?
Think about it. Like if you didn't know that in advance, like as a Jew who studied the law, and then you hear Jesus say that, that would shock you.
It would, because you go, "Oh my gosh, it was right there in front of us." Yeah, it was right there in front of you.
Exactly.
So again, now you're saying a crazy man is making these very intelligent, very academic, very big points to show up guys who've been studying this their whole life. That's really hard for me to believe.
Yeah. And so now, of course, we have seen crazy lunatics who have started cults, right? And teaching things that are untrue. However, if this is the case with Jesus, how is it that his teachings have stood the test of time, right? Right, because 2,000 years of the greatest minds in history have studied and scrutinized the things that he taught. And it's crazy because you look at other cults and religions, like last week we talked about Mormonism, right? And I even kind of dip my toe in the water a little bit in describing some of the inaccuracies that came out of the Book of Mormon.
The Book of
and
Mormon is full of
things that have
inaccuracies.
changed, right?
Yeah.
So you see, it didn't stand the test of time.
No.
So, but then whereas you look at Scripture and the teachings that Jesus had after 2,000 years of being heavily critiqued and investigated, it has still stood the test of time. So this does not make sense if these are just the ramblings of some crazy guy who wanted to start a cult, right?
No, they're not. And the other thing too is that you get into this idea of Christianity, the teachings of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, right, spread across the whole world really fast in the first century. And we have that from Josephus and Tacitus, who were talking about how Christianity is in Rome before the end of the first century.
Right,
so we know it's spreading all over, this ideology. And if it's just this, think about it, like from the extreme crazy lunatic cult leaders that we've seen in our day, like you think about the Branch Davidians, and you think about Jonestown, and you think about all these different people, and there's like a crazy madman leading a small group of people. But most everybody else is like, they're not.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Nobody's buying it, right? Like they're
extreme.
But this idea begins to completely take over the world. So much so that by the 300s, Constantine makes it the religion of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, it's
like
that is mind-boggling. Yeah.
It is. So again, it doesn't make it true, but it definitely is hard to believe that a crazy man is behind all this stuff with his academic, with his intelligence, with how he argued with the smartest people of his time. And then, like you said, how it stood the test of the last 2,000 years. I don't think Jesus could have been a crazy man.
I think if you're still trying to be consistent with that idea, like with what we see today, you would have to argue that just literally everybody out there is a lunatic. I'm just saying. Yeah, I'm just saying. Like realistically, you do because if he's getting like masses of educated people to get behind him, or at the very least, like say that what he said was credible, then you would have to argue that they're lunatics too, and that's where the consistency has to be key. Yep. So I think that's something important to note. But yeah, so that kind of wraps up the idea of like the lunatic idea here.
Yeah. And hardly anybody, and again, with both of these, like these are the 2 of 4 options. The first 2 of 4 options. And we were talking about this before, like nobody really argues that Jesus was intentionally deceiving people because it's so crazy. That's like saying Mother Teresa hated Indian people.
Right, yeah.
Really? But she served her whole life with the poorest of people in India? Like that doesn't make sense. It's like saying Martin Luther King Jr. was racist.
Exactly.
Really? Like
it's kind of like
everything he said and everything he did go against that idea.
Yeah. It's exactly like what I brought up with the last point, right? It comes down to like people who are arguing this point at this point are not really that well educated.
Yeah, and I don't think a lot of people will say he was a liar.
No,
and I don't think a lot of people will say he was a crazy person. But if you press him on that, you go, then what was he? So if he's not lying intentionally or unintentionally,
right?
Then who was this guy, right?
Yeah,
that's
where
where
it comes
Lewis
down to.
says, well, he must be the Lord, and we're going to talk about that later. But there is a 4th option.
Yes.
That has arisen in kind of modern times in our day and age. And the 4th option is this idea that Jesus isn't a liar, he isn't a lunatic, he isn't Lord, but he is a legend.
Okay.
He's a legend. He's a myth. And here are a few quotes of what skeptics are saying about the legend hypothesis. So this comes from John Dominic Crossan in A Tale of Two Gods. John Dominic Crossan is one of the founders of the Jesus Seminar, which is a super, super skeptical, liberal organization that hardly believes any of the New Testament's accurate, and hardly any of the sayings in the New Testament by Jesus are really sayings he said. Super skeptic. This is what John Dominic Crossan says. Quote, Jesus' divine origins are just as fictional or mythological as those of Octavius. Neither should be taken literally. Both must be taken metaphorically, end quote. So you see, this is a myth. It's a legendary development. This is King Arthur. This is Robin Hood. This isn't.
Yeah, that's what they're saying.
This isn't anchored in history. Bart Ehrman, in his book Jesus Interrupted, said, quote, I had come to realize that Jesus' divinity was part of John's theology, not part of Jesus' own teaching. End quote. So you see, Bart Ehrman saying the theology developed. The idea of who Jesus was over time, passing from when he lived, developed into these stories and these myths and these legendary accounts. And then later in time, John writes down this stuff, or whoever wrote John, he would say, whoever wrote John, wrote down these ideas about Jesus' divinity. He didn't rise from the dead. He didn't claim to be God. All of these things are later legendary accounts.
Okay, yeah, and again, I have another quote from Ehrman where he touches on this. He says, Jesus probably never called himself God. And to make my point, I suggest that, in fact, there were not 3 options, but 4, liar, lunatic, lord, or legend. Of course, I choose the 4th word to maintain the alliteration.
Oh, stop right there. I love that. Do you see what he's saying?
Mm-hmm.
I'm very clever.
He did say that.
I chose the 4th word, legend, because it gets an L word. Look at me. Whatever. Anyway, sorry to interrupt the quote.
Actually, no, I'm glad you did. That's a good point. But yeah, then he goes on to say, what I meant was that not Jesus himself was a legend. Of course not. I certainly believe that he existed and that we can say some things about him. What I meant was that the idea that he called himself God was a legend, which I believe it is. This means that he doesn't have to be either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. He could be a first-century Palestinian Jew who had a message to proclaim other than his own divinity.
See,
right?
So he's a legend, right?
Yeah.
The stories of his divinity, resurrection, all of that stuff didn't take place, but there was a real person, and then later on, legendary accounts of him developed.
Exactly. Yeah, you see that they argue that Jesus is not a liar, lunatic, Lord, but that he's in fact a legend. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kind of arguing that this historical person became a legend through these myths and built up followers, right? Yep. And it makes sense of what they're trying to case, because they're trying to say that over time, each of these educated people, all these like Christians and theologians that came on, just kept piling on, right?
Yeah.
That's their train of thought.
And they're really not blaming Jesus. It's an interesting change of course, because...
It's because they know they can't blame.
Well, to say Jesus was a liar is blaming him.
Exactly.
To say he's a crazy person is blaming him. I don't want to say he is who he said he was. Therefore, I'm going to make the disciples or the writers of the New Testament the bad guys.
Yeah, that's
and
exactly.
And they embellished who he was. It's an interesting move, right? It's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's very, very interesting. But there are many reasons why this kind of hypothesis fails. But one of the main reasons is because we can date the core teaching of Christianity, which is, we talk about this many times on the podcast, the resurrection of Jesus as being taught in Jerusalem, somewhere between 6 months to 3 years after the death of Jesus, right?
Yeah, and this is important because if you want to claim that Jesus' divinity, resurrection are legendary accounts, then you have to have a significant amount of time between when Jesus lived to when mythology developed about him.
Yes, you have exactly
time. So time is the magic thing here. But the problem with that is, based on the New Testament writings, these historical documents that we have, we can put together a timeline that in Jerusalem, the disciples were teaching that the resurrection of Jesus occurred, and we can pinpoint this happening somewhere between 6 months to 3 years after Jesus died.
Yeah.
So people in Jerusalem were claiming these things really close to the events themselves, which doesn't give enough time for legendary accounts to develop.
Yeah.
Like, think about it. This coming year is 2021. So of September of next year, it will be 20 years since 9/11 happened.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? You can't convince me of craziness about 9/11.
No.
You couldn't change even small facts about it to me, because I was 17 years old when it happened.
Yeah,
I remember it. So you couldn't tell me it was Hindus who flew into the Twin Towers. No, it wasn't. I know who it was, right? I literally know names of the bad guys who enacted this thing. You couldn't tell me that they crashed into Mount Rushmore. No, they didn't. They were trying to crash into the Pentagon, and they were trying to crash into the Twin Towers.
Yeah, and
in New York
they
City,
tried to crash into the White House, but weren't successful.
Exactly. And so,
you know these things.
We know these things because I lived then. So 20 years isn't even enough for legendary accounts to develop.
Right. Yeah.
So this is where it gets interesting. There are 7 letters of the Apostle Paul that atheist New Testament scholars agree the Apostle Paul actually wrote.
Yes.
All right? 2 of them are 1 Corinthians and Galatians. There's no dispute that Paul, the guy we believe existed in the first century, wrote these.
Yes.
Everybody agrees he wrote these because
That's right.
the historical credibility is too strong. So in 1 Corinthians, one of the undisputed letters of Paul, we find the creed about Jesus' resurrection. And I want to read this to you. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. Paul tells the Corinthians, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Okay? So right there. I gave you what I received. And then he's quoting something. I told you this when I was with you guys. Exactly. And then he quotes, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. So scholars agree this is an early Christian saying or creed or hymn. It's oral tradition kind of thing. And Paul says, I gave to you what I had received, the gospel. Here it is, this quote. You remember this, Corinthians. Well, when was Paul in Corinth? We know when Paul was in Corinth exactly because we've dated it archaeologically.
That's a very specific timestamp there.
Yeah, we have a timestamp of Paul being in Corinth in 51 AD. And it's because we have this piece of archaeology that was found at Delphi, which is close to Corinth, and it's called the Gallio inscription. And it puts this guy Gallio as being the proconsul of Corinth in 51 AD, between 51 and 52 AD. And Acts 18 tells us that Paul stood before the proconsul Gallio, and he passed judgment on Paul because the Jews were bringing him saying he's teaching all this crazy stuff.
Yeah.
So Paul was there while Gallio was the proconsul, which is 51 AD. That's when Paul went to Corinth for the first time. So in 51 AD, Paul gives the Corinthians this creed, all right? But he says he received it. So the question becomes, okay, where did Paul get this from? So it exists in 51. So think about this. If Jesus died in 30, we're talking 21 years later, there's this developed theology about his resurrection, his death, burial, resurrection, and his appearances to people. That's not enough time for legendary accounts to develop.
It's not.
And he even says in there, listen, some of these people have died who saw him, 500 at one time, but some are still alive. He's like urging them, go check it out. Like, you can look at the evidence yourself. Not enough time for legendary accounts to develop.
Yeah. And again, I like the 9/11 analogy that you
it's almost been 20 years.
It is, yeah. So it's like for those of you listening to this and like really just think through how that feels to you, like the timestamp that's there, like the time gap between now and 9/11. That's the time gap that we're talking here with these writings. So that's kind of what we're looking at.
Well,
right?
and but we can do better than that.
Well, we can.
So this is when Paul was in Corinth and he gave them this is 20 years later, but he said he received it. So now we got to ask the question, okay, he has it in 51. When did he get it? Now we're going further back in time.
Wow, look at that.
Right? So now you ask the question, when did he get it? And by looking at 1 Corinthians and Galatians, you can put together a timeline of when Paul would have received this creed. So what happens is Paul, you know the story if you've read through the book of Acts. He's going to persecuting Christians. He's going to arrest Christians on the road to Damascus. Jesus shows up to him and changes the course of his life forever, right? Paul says in Galatians 1:15 through 17, but when God, who'd set me apart even from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, he showed up on the road to Damascus, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia and returned to Damascus once more. Then 3 years later, Galatians 18 says, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas, and I stayed with him 15 days. But I didn't see any of the other apostles except for James, the Lord's brother. Okay. Oh, and then Paul says, now in what I'm writing you, I assure you before God, I'm not lying.
Yeah.
He's like pushing them. Listen, this is my testimony. This is what happened to me. So let's say Paul's conversion happens somewhere, everyone agrees, somewhere between, 4 to 6 years after Jesus' resurrection.
Right.
So we're talking plus 4 to 6 years. And then, plus 3 years is what it is. And then another 3 years, and then he goes and he meets Peter. So at the most, we're talking 6 years after Jesus' death, Paul goes to talk with Peter. Okay? And it's interesting because when he says, I went to get acquainted with Peter, the word he uses for acquainted is this word hysterese. It's where we get our word history from.
Yeah.
So he's saying, I went to get a historical account from Peter. It's not like I'm just hanging out. I went to just be like, okay, you knew Jesus. he showed up to me. What's the deal?
Yeah.
Give me an account of what went on. Tell me what happened. Then Paul goes off and he's working with Barnabas and he's doing missionary journeys and stuff. And then what he says in Galatians is really crazy. In Galatians 2, he says, 2, 1 and 2, he says, then after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas. So 14 years later, this is after he's gone on missionary journeys. Right? This is after he's planted churches. This is after he's preached the gospel. So he already knew the gospel before this, right? He says, I went up and I submitted to them, the guys in Jerusalem, who are Peter and James and John. I submitted to them the gospel which I preached among the Gentile, but I did so in private to those who were of reputation for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. He freaks out and he goes, I better be sure about this gospel thing.
Of course, yes.
Right? It's a big deal.
Yeah.
So he wants to make sure he hadn't been running in vain. He goes on in Galatians 2 to say that those who are of reputation, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me. They said, you got it. Yeah, you got the gospel, man. He submits to them what he's been preaching. James, John, and Peter are like, that's it.
Yeah, he got peer reviewed.
Yeah, and they say you're teaching the truth, man. Like, remember when you came up here 14 years ago and we told you, yeah, you've got it. And then he says that they gave him the right hand of fellowship and they sent him to go and to continue his missionary journeys. So this is interesting, Tyler, because you ask, when would he have received this Christian creed? It would have been the first time he went and he hystereseed with Peter.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is somewhere between 4 to 6 years after Jesus' death. Now the question is this. He gets it from Peter. Well, Peter already has it. When did it develop, right? Where did it come from? How do we date this saying and when it developed? So he gets it in Jerusalem from the brother and the first disciple, best disciple, most important disciple of Jesus. And it's all about the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus.
Yes.
It's
That's
crazy.
right.
So now this is where it gets interesting. So the Jesus Seminar, remember John Dominic Crossings, we quoted him earlier.
Yes, that's right.
In studying this extremely skeptical organization, scrutinizing, they say that there is no way that this saying, this early Christian creed that we find Paul talking about in 1 Corinthians 15, they say it couldn't come any later than 2 years after Jesus died. That's crazy. Gerd Ludemann, who is a German atheistic New Testament scholar, he says that this creed couldn't come any more than 3 years after Jesus died.
Yeah.
People in Jerusalem were saying this about Jesus 3 years at the most after he died. Larry Hurtado, who was at Edinburgh, Richard Bauckham, who was at Cambridge, they all say this material comes from about 30 AD. So they're saying it's in the same year Jesus died.
That's
And James,
that's quite a range.
James Dunn, he believes that the latest it could have been would have been somewhere around 6 months after Jesus died and rose from the grave. With the analysis, with when they take into account how long it took for sayings to become popular and formulated and all that in the first century, right? So now think about this. How could the resurrection be legendary accounts if atheistic scholars are saying, this idea about death, burial, resurrection, and appearances was being said in the town where it was supposed to happen somewhere between 6 months to 3 years after it happened?
Yeah.
No way can that be legendary.
No, not at all.
This idea that Jesus' divinity and Jesus' resurrection are legendary accounts is nonsense when you do the academic New Testament critical scholarship. Yeah,
it is. It just, you see through all these examples that the idea of Jesus being a legend doesn't hold water. It's just not possible.
It's not.
Yeah, and so that's the thing, right? It's what if Jesus never said these things, right? What if they are made up by the writers of the New Testament?
So that's a shift we got to think about because we're assuming Jesus actually said these things in the Bible,
of course,
and he's either lying about it, he's either crazy, or these are fabrications from some of his followers and its legendary account, right? But let's now, because people will say, Tyler, you don't know if the words in the Bible are actually stuff Jesus said. You're trusting the people who wrote it that he said it. So now we want to take it a layer back and say, okay, well, how do we know that these authors are writing accurate stuff?
Exactly.
Right? So how could we go about this?
Well, yeah, exactly. This is a good question. Like, we need to apply this liar, lunatic, legend argument to them as well, I think. I think that's the best way to investigate this.
Yeah, so not just to Jesus, but to the writers in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And again, we don't even, I think this is cool.
Because that's what would be happening.
Yeah.
Essentially, yeah.
We don't have to even say it was his disciples. Now, I believe it was, Peter who wrote the Gospel of Mark through John Mark wrote it down, but it's the Gospel according to Peter.
Yeah, right.
And I believe Matthew actually wrote Matthew, and I believe John actually wrote John. But there's people who say, we don't know who actually wrote them, blah, blah, blah. Okay, whatever. We know that they're around in the first century because we have quotes of them from other people in the first century.
Oh, yeah,
So it's tough for them to be quoting stuff that they don't have. So we don't even need to argue over who wrote the New Testament. We just need to ask the question, okay, how do we know the New Testament authors are depicting real history? And you're saying we can apply the liar, lunatic, legend argument to whoever wrote the New Testament.
I think that's what we should do. Because the thing is, if you look at it, and if it turns out that the historians, all the gospel writers and the apostles, if they are not liar, lunatics, or legends, if they really existed, they told the truth, and they were not crazy, then that clearly gives credibility to their historical account.
Yes.
It would.
So are they lying? What do we think?
That's what we need to start with. And now the question is like again, I think let's throw it back to what did they get to gain out of this, right? If they were lying.
Yeah. What did the New Testament writers gain? So people who are proposing Christianity, what did they gain?
That's the question, right? And now the gospel writers and the writers of the New Testament, they did not gain really anything. They lost a lot of things. We see all throughout. As far as earthly possessions, we see all throughout church history and throughout some scripture accounts of what happened to them, that they were thrown to lions. Right?
Yeah, early Christians were thrown to lions. Yep.
They were burned as torches at Nero's dinner parties.
Yeah,
and
Nero
that
burned
happened to Christians all the time.
Covered them with tree sap and would use them as human torches for garden parties. Yeah,
yeah, and then not only that, they didn't gain any money out of it, or sex, or power, or fame. In fact, they were kind of being heavily persecuted through this. A lot of them were imprisoned. And clearly they were not really excited about what they were gaining from it because of all the negative attention that they were getting.
Yeah.
When Peter, when he's under pressure and talking about how he denied Jesus 3 times, right? He was he denied it because he's I don't want to be associated with him because there's a lot of bad, I don't get anything from this.
And they have to keep, the other thing is so the writers of the New Testament keep saying, hey, consider it joy when you suffer, because we're going to suffer. Yeah. And I know that you're into diaspora and you're going to suffer, but don't worry about it because we want to suffer like Jesus did, because there's hope that we're going to rise from the dead. So if they're lying about that, think about this. They're admitting that suffering's happening to their group.
Yeah.
So they're admitting suffering's coming upon us. But I'm lying about these ideas. So wouldn't you want to eliminate suffering in your life by saying, okay, jig's up. We're just kidding.
And you know what
this
I
is all
think?
A hoax.
You know what I think, though? I think really, too, and I'm sure, I think this is one of the biggest uses that God had in all of their deaths, is that by the disciples faithfully believing in Jesus and everything that he did, all the way up into death, is a testimony in the fact that they genuinely believed it. Yeah. Because they're putting their money where their mouth is by literally dying for this, because they're saying, I'm so confident that I am going to live in eternity that I'm willing to die for.
Well, we had a lot of early Christians doing that very thing.
Of course, yeah.
So that's where it gets down to, okay, the writers of the New Testament, I don't think they could have been lying about it, because again, if Jesus never said any of these things, but they're making up this phenomenal moral virtue ethic. First of all, where do they get these ideas from? that's a whole nother discussion. Is
Exactly.
Where could they fabricate these things from, and where could they fabricate them from 4 times? There has to be some kind of source material that they're using because they're all so similar. So anyway, there's all that problem.
Yeah.
But you're telling me that these people made up these legendary accounts to lie about this moral virtue, but then they're not following it. So why would anybody even take them seriously with this message? It's the same thing with Jesus, right?
Exactly.
So if he didn't say it and they're making it up, you've still got the same problem about they couldn't have been lying about it because they were pushing this idea. And the other thing is, we even have historical accounts from Tacitus and from Josephus, and they talk about how Christians get together and they talk and they give to one another and they're benevolent. And you go, wait a second, that's such a crazy idea, right? Why would you do that if you're lying to get something? So that doesn't make a lot of sense, which makes a lot of people think, well, maybe the lunatic aspect applies to the writers of the New Testament.
Yeah, and that's right. That's the next question. It's like, so were they crazy? Right?
Could have been crazy.
That's exactly the case. So, but the question is how could they write such amazing ethical teaching of Jesus, and that are all reinforced by each other in different books and different accounts of this fictional person?
Yeah.
Right? How could they all make this up?
Yeah.
And then the crazy thing is we see too what I meant by they all affirm each other in their accounts in different books. They unknowingly affirm each other a lot in just subtle details that they write about, things that tie in and give us more information about what another author was saying or vice versa, because they were telling the truth, right?
Which just screams eyewitness testimony.
Exactly.
Is what we
that's
have.
That's exactly it. Yep. When you're like when police are investigating eyewitness testimony, that's a major thing they look for, is connecting the dots between the stories that are different accounts.
Yeah, one definition makes another definition make sense because there's a detail in this definition that was left out of this one. But then when you put them together, it harmonizes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're looking at. So it just kind of gets a little bit, I think it's a little difficult to challenge that and say that the New Testament writers were crazy.
It is hard to say that because the writings are first of all, again, they've stood the test of 2,000 years of people reading these books, and it's the most translated book ever. It's the most popular book ever, and you're saying it was written by lunatics.
Yeah.
I don't know if that really holds water, right? And then again, it gets back to how did they gain such a huge following among Jews, but also among Gentiles? So you've got all these Romans converting, you've got all these Pharisees converting, right? Yeah. You've got politicians in the Roman government in Corinth and in Crete convert to Christianity and start helping Paul out. And you go, it's hard to believe if it's written by lunatics.
Yeah,
if it's written by crazy guys who actually believe this stuff, but it didn't occur, right? And then the question becomes, how did this idea continue to gain steam and momentum after the deaths of these crazy men? So they wrote a book that was so amazing and phenomenal that it had the force of, through sacrificing love and being kind and praying for your enemies, is what they taught. It has the force to continue for 2,000 years and become the religion of the Roman Empire, 250 years later.
Yeah,
it's such a crazy idea that it was lunatics who wrote it.
Yeah, and then that kind of goes into our last option, right? Again, is the legendary account, right?
Yeah, maybe these are legendary accounts.
Yeah.
Nobody's lying intentionally. No one's crazy. They're just mistakes.
Yeah, like maybe they started writing about these events and then legend took over and theology developed, right?
Yeah, and maybe the writers in the New Testament weren't eyewitnesses to it, and they're just hearing secondhand stories.
Sure.
And they're putting a hodgepodge together. That would be the legendary account, right?
Yeah. But the thing is legendary accounts, it's interesting. So they would either be lies because the writers knew that they were not true, or mistakes, like you said.
Okay.
So then if lies, then we must ask, what did they gain from these lies,
so it
right?
goes back to the liar
It goes back to it. And you just kind of can keep going down this cycle, right?
Yep.
Of a liar, lunatic, legend, because that's the case. It's like, if mistakes were made.
So not intentional lies, but just mistakes.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Not because you're crazy.
Yes.
Just because you don't know.
Yes, okay. Exactly. If mistakes, then we must ask how they created such amazing ethical teaching of self-sacrifice, love, and challenging the social and religious norms of the day. And where did they get those insights from, right?
Yeah, where did
you get this from? Because you know what? If that's the case, then maybe there's some pretty good teaching going on that developed in. I mean, it's just like
ideas come from somewhere.
They have to come from somewhere. Yeah, and so that's really what it boils down to: is where did they get this from?
So what we would have to believe is there was this carpenter named Jesus who was just a regular dude who probably taught some stuff, but he wasn't God and he didn't rise from the dead. He then gets killed, and for some reason, a whole bunch of people follow him after he gets killed, claiming 6 months to 2 years later that he died and he rose from the dead, and he appeared to a whole bunch of people after that, and that he promises them that they can rise from the dead too. But it didn't happen. And then there was legendary development within this group that took over and spread across the entire world within 50 years. And all of it was legendary accounts, but they weren't lying intentionally. They were just mistaken about it.
Yeah, that's
I don't think you could get Christianity from that mess of mixing these hypotheses together.
You can't. It's just it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't hold water. That's
really tough. It's really tough to come up with evidence that proves those ideas.
Yeah. And so I would say that after looking at all of these, the fourth option that we discussed earlier seems to make the most sense, and that's that Jesus is Lord.
Yeah,
because
he is who he says he is.
The thing is, you know what? We could go on and on about all these different reasons. I remember, I don't know if you remember this, but this stuck with me. Back in high school, you had us do this little exercises like your youth group students, where you had us get into teams and groups of people, and you had us try to come up with some excuse for Christianity not being true, right? You had us all come up with our own stories of what happened.
Okay.
Rather than
where it came from, because it's here.
Where it came from.
We got to say it's here. So where did it come from?
Exactly. Yeah. And I can remember everybody said that the best that of all the groups could come up with was aliens. That was it.
Exactly.
Aliens came down.
They tricked us all.
They tricked us all.
Magic.
And with, again, absolutely crazy, outlandish idea.
No evidence,
Yeah, and it's honestly, we all laughed about it because it's laughable. It's a joke.
But it's the best option.
But that's the best option. Yeah, and so it's just a matter of looking at this from a broader perspective of saying, there's really no other explanation for this.
Yeah. And so, I think Jesus is who he said he is. And I think Jesus is who the disciples claimed he was. And their willingness to die for it, right? And not gain sex, money, or power from it is huge. I don't think they're crazy based on the stuff that's taught in the Bible. It's phenomenal. I don't think anybody would think that it was crazy, right?
So that brings us, again, to the point, right? Jesus is Lord, and this idea is way simpler than the other ones.
It makes more sense, yeah.
Jesus is Lord, and we need to take seriously his message. That's the idea.
Yeah, but people rage against that. And that's where the atheists and the agnostics are at is, first of all, like there's this idea, it's just this prevalent attitude, I guess, in our culture with certain people, not everybody, but a lot of people are just skeptic, just question everything.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Well, couldn't it be, Tyler? Well, couldn't it be? Well, I don't know. And it's like, you can't just remain a perpetual skeptic. You can't just doubt everything all the time. Eventually, you have to land somewhere on something. That's why I appreciate like guys like Bart Ehrman. He's actually studying this stuff, and he's trying to take the data and say, okay, how do I make sense of these historical accounts? There's something that happened in the past because I have these books. Where do they come from? What's valid? What's not? I can't just dismiss this stuff because it's here. It's real.
Yeah.
But how do I make conclusions about what I believe they're saying? So I appreciate guys like that who are really wading in stuff. But so many people that I meet just blow it off.
Yeah, because the thing you see with Bart Ehrman is like he's consistent, right? Well, like he doesn't like have this this kind of void of theology or just mentality that he's keeping where he just ignores or sweeps things under the rug.
He has answers for things.
Yeah, he has answers, and he seeks answers, and he tries to come to some sort of a conclusion, rather than you see a lot of skeptics, agnostics, atheists in his position who would just argue, oh, I don't need to have the answers because...
Yeah, they'll just question. Like, you tell me why you believe what you believe. And then you say,
exactly.
Well, you tell me why you believe what you believe. And they go, I don't need to tell you that because I just don't believe anything. It's It's like, well, you believe I'm wrong, so you, you need to tell me why you think. Yeah, it's an annoying. It's kind of an annoying position.
Yeah,
and it's like you can't just be a perpetual skeptic. Eventually, you have to make a decision on where you land with.
Yeah,
this
you
stuff.
can't just say like I'm an atheist, meaning I lack a belief in God.
No, because it's not just a lack.
It's not a lack of a belief. You're believing in something.
It is a belief. Yep. And so that's why we have to look at this stuff and say, okay, we have these books about Jesus. Where did they come from? Was this guy who they claim he was, or are these lies?
Right.
Are these ravings of crazy people? Are these Robin Hood legendary accounts of King Arthur's court? Or is it legit? I guess that's my L word.
Yeah,
is it legit?
Is it legit? I like that.
Legit.
That's pretty clever.
That's pretty clever. Take that. Yeah. And so, again, I think it's legit. I think that these documents hold up to extreme scrutiny. And I think that, man, 6 months to 3 years isn't enough time for legend to develop about a guy coming back from the dead in the town where it was supposed to happen. Nobody would believe that. Nobody'd be saying that. Nobody'd take it seriously. And yet this idea just permeates the religious establishment, and then it permeates the known world. It's very hard to believe that that was a fabrication, a lie, a crazy raving, or a legendary account. I think it was legitimate. I think Jesus is Lord. I think he is who he said he is. And again, we need to take his message seriously.
Yes, we absolutely do.
Well, hey guys, thank you so much for being with us today. We hope that this has been an encouragement to you. If you have questions or comments, please send us an email or Instagram message or Facebook message or however you want to get a hold of us. It's pretty easy to do. Also, make sure you come back next week because we're going to be talking about another counterfeit Jesus. We've covered the LDS counterfeit. We've covered the agnostic, atheist counterfeit. We've got a few more coming in the next following weeks. But again, we want this podcast to be about equipping you to be confident in your faith and helping you to go out and to share your faith with other people. That is our goal. Is we want you to be fortified in your faith. We want
be
you
educated,
to be established in your faith, so that you have good answers to give people as to why you believe what you believe. We've got to have good answers.
Yes.
That's the key.
We absolutely do. So thank you guys so much for joining us today on Christ Culture and Coffee. We will see you next week.